Well, thank you very much for coming back. Please have a seat and we will start in a moment. So now we come to the really interesting and exciting part of the program where you, the audience, get to quiz our panelists. Before we get to that, there's a few questions that I would like to use just to warm them up a little bit to the questions which I'm sure will come from you. Let's start with looking at the question of efficiency around the energy sector, the water sector, and the industrial side of things. And I'll go in sort of random order. John, you spoke about how industries really need to bring out a greater level of efficiency. And you would think that that's something that makes good logical sense. And all the industries and industrial sectors should be automatically doing that. But we know, in fact, that that is not universally true. And the question is, what really are the roadblocks to industries in going in that direction? Are they hampered by regulations? Are they hampered by competition? What is it?
I think it's a little bit of everything, really. But a lot of what I feel is that they have so many other priorities driving their bottom lines. As I mentioned, they're looking at labor availability, markets where the products are made and sold. And these, for them, are often much more significant drivers financially than getting hold of water and energy that they need. I think water and energy becomes a problem when they're in areas of scarcity or poor distribution of power, for example, or something like that. But they would preferentially locate to go for markets and labor and that sort of thing ahead of water and energy in many cases, because that's a bigger driver for them and more important in many ways. Even now, centers of innovation, a lot of industry is targeting those and dealing with the other issues behind that sort of thing. So we see a lot of different factors pulling them in different directions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And of course, we talked about also the asymmetries between water and energy, and Torgny highlighted that quite well. And the question is that, are there also asymmetries in the knowledge which is available to the two sectors? Are there gaps? And are there ways in which we can address the gap? And if you can catch my drift, what I'm leading to is, how does the World Water Week next week try to address some of those gaps, which there would be? So if you can identify what the gaps are, if there are any, and how would we go about addressing those?
Yes, I believe there are gaps in our understanding and knowledge, not only maybe in the water community, but also to reaching out to address the water issues, which is quite important for other sectors. And our aim for next World Water Week is to bring in energy sector people to come to discuss with us, because I think energy, to my mind, is, well, it's not far ahead, but they are ahead of water when it comes to this efficiency and also knowledge on to utilize the scarce resource, which is it is. So our aim is to broaden the knowledge scope and also bring it over and maybe bridge the knowledge gap in between the water community or the water sector and the energy sector. I think that is a first step in that direction.
Okay, thank you very much. We also talked about another type of gap, which are capacity gaps. And these are capacity gaps within water and within energy, and there's also a capacity gap between water and energy. And Ingvar, you spoke about capacity building as a sort of a crucial building block of how we start to address the challenges. How do we go about addressing those capacity needs? You shared some interesting models of how you train individuals, but you also need institutions on the other side to retain these individuals and to actually make use of their capacity. So how do we go about doing that?
Well, this is very correct. It is sometimes even more important to train people at the top of the institutions, make them understand the need for this. And this has taken some time in several years in different parts of the world. But what is so good is once they see the light then they will pick out their best young people, men and women, and nominate them for training. And also for the people, for the young scientists and engineers who are starting to work with companies in various countries. This is also a challenge to them to see if they will be selected. So in a way, we are taking the cream off, so to speak.
Sure.
And similarly, we always start the training program for each continent, or we have only basically done this mostly only for Africa and Latin America. And then we have a workshop for decision makers, where we have heads of geological surveys, often permanent secretaries from energy ministries and so on, and several people from each of the countries in the area, and go through the process that is needed in geothermal development. We held this also in China for Asian countries. There we go in a different way because they are dealing with warm water for space heating and cooling, but the others are with high temperature. And with these courses, which are for laymen basically, but to explain to the top people in the ministries and with the companies what is involved, then they understand better when these young people come back home filled with enthusiasm and mention all kinds of numbers in how many they need to employ, what equipment they need, and especially what it costs to drill the first research well. Their mind is much more open. So I think you have to look at this, look at the whole spectrum. And there is no need to go straight just for the training. You have to also build up the knowledge and the visibility for the decision makers in the countries of what you're doing. I'm sure that this applies also to potable water and so on.
So if I understand you correctly, it's a combination of government response and the private sector response that can help build the institutional hosting space for these
Yes.
brilliant people who go back to their
Yes.
countries.
Indeed.
Well, thank you. We're Zleilam, we're talking about the gaps, and you pointed out some gaps in the energy sector, and particularly in the East African context. We heard that hydropower capacity is not fully utilized, and we know those numbers are often mentioned. But the question is that there's also efficiency gaps in the energy sector. How do we go about minimizing those? And as we've heard, back here in 2011, the Stockholm Statement talked about producing more kilowatts per drop of water. So how do we address this gap in energy generation efficiency that will already yield us some immediate dividends?
Thank you. Thank you for these questions. Yes, I totally agree that there are already efficiency gaps in the Eastern Africa power pool members, power systems, in the overall systems, not only for the hydro or powers, but there are a number of measures being undertaken to improve this efficiency. But now the main issue is the expansion of the system, given the vast amount of hydro generation potential in the region. So that's why I raised the level of access is very minimal. The available hydro potential could be developed and could provide at least cost power, which is desperately needed for access expansion. So there are already efficiency measures being taken at the national levels to improve the efficiency of the existing facilities. But the major issue is the expansion of the new hydro facilities.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That's helpful to see that there's already some positive change which is coming about. Speaking of change, Bhushan, you talked about a lot of innovations in cities and some very interesting examples. What you didn't get into so much was how does that type of innovation get resourced? Is it coming from energy sector, water sector? Is government bringing in money? Are there outside donors who are empowering through bringing in resources? What's the key to bringing about innovation at the urban level?
Direct answer, I don't know. Where is the resource coming from? Because it's difficult to see that. A lot of examples that what I've said is coming from the water industry. Yes, the Chennai Water Board or the Sydney Water and so on. I assume that it's the water companies themselves or the water board, and if it's a government agency, the municipality, and so putting in the money. What we don't see so far, and of course to operate it, then there is the customers, the clients who are footing the bill as well. What we don't see so far is not much financing on the innovation side from major development partners and so on. One example would be just an example, and this is, for example, in Nepal, in Kathmandu. Right? There's a big project underway to bring water into Kathmandu Valley from the next valley, which is 28 kilometers away. Several people had raised the issue of, well, you could combine that with a hydropower plant. Kathmandu is located at an elevation. You're bringing water from further away and at an elevation, so and hydropower plant there, plus a hydropower plant downstream to get that wastewater as well, and you could generate as much as 250 megawatts out of there, which is great. And these megawatts are being generated at very close to the point of use, so transmission losses are reduced significantly. But that was never taken up seriously. One problem was that, again, people thinking in silos, and the energy people are totally different from the water people, and people don't want to make things more complex than they actually are. So I think in the innovation side, it's coming from the water utilities themselves, trying to reduce their costs, looking at ways how they could make the systems more efficient, and so on. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Rick, you talked about sort of a global analysis and a regional analysis. So I can maybe pose a very similar question because you've looked at the sort of the big picture in terms of the water energy nexus. Is there enough investment going into it? And if not, are there ways for changing that equation to actually, and I'm not talking about separate investment into energy and separate investment into water, which we know is happening. Where's the investment coming into where the two combine?
Good question. Is this on? Good question. There's no, I don't think any government, whether it's provincial or federal, national, has a budget line for water and energy. So if you're talking about public investment, it would come from on a project by project basis. So you're looking at possibilities for coexistence or coordinated plants, for instance, that are both power plants and desal plants. Or because the power plant, if it's a thermal plant, then you can use open loop, and then you're heating water, and then you use that extra heat for the water to facilitate you can use that heat to facilitate the evaporation process or the osmosis process for your desal. There's other coupled projects. We talked about the biogas, for instance, from wastewater. I think I agree that it's probably led mainly by the water domain, the water sector. Let's call it the water services sector, because we, at least with WAP, we've been, in the last few reports, we've been trying to differentiate the fact that energy is a sector, agriculture is a sector. Water has a sector, the water, water services, but it's also a resource, and sometimes you're managing sometimes you're managing water resources, sometimes you're managing for water services. And so when you're talking about the water energy nexus, this kind of gets lost. Are you talking about water as the service provision, or are you talking about water as a resource required for energy? And these are different. So the reason I'm getting into this detail is because if you're asking for a project-by-project basis, then you're not talking about water resources management, you are talking about water services management.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very sort of a nuanced description of what happens at the ground level, and that means that complexity may or may not be reflected at the planning levels. Josefina, you talked about bringing together partnerships to address some of these gaps that we've now heard about. And I think you talked about some very interesting mechanisms for generating partnerships. What I would like to pin you is on, can you share with us some examples of what partnerships are there which are actually working and working well?
Yes. When I gave you a little bit of the overview of what has been going on out there, I think one has to recognize that there has been more collaboration on the utility level and the industrial level. Especially when the industries are talking about improving efficiencies in the supply chain, because inside the companies there is an interest of improving water and energy efficiency. But when you're talking about partnerships, then you have to partner with others outside of your own company. So that would be talking about the supply chain. In relation to the utilities, that's where I think there has been more examples of collaboration. And particularly in those areas where there are opportunities for cost savings and for improving benefits. I think what you were also asking the question before, and I will come back to your question as well, is in relation to how you finance that. In the examples that I have been reviewing, that really is internal to the company. But the idea that you collaborate because there are incentives, but the incentives in the utilities, both in the collaboration between energy and water utilities, is because they can save cost by the collaboration. They can either they can do joint marketing campaigns, for example. They can do joint billing, so that will help them both. They can help each other to do purchasing, because a lot of the times, as it was said before, is that there are public companies have more difficulties in some kind of purchases, so that if you join a partnership, that may make it easier for the public sector providers. So that's the kind of examples we are talking about.
Okay, perfect. Good. The audience has been waiting quite patiently, so let me open up the floor for any questions. Please introduce yourself, your name and your organizational affiliation, and if you're directing it to one of the panelists, please identify them. Otherwise, we'll ask the panelists to give a combined answer, and we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then take it back to the panelists. So, sir, you in the backs.
Thank you very much. Brian Matthew. First of all, I'd like to say how pleased I am to see that the Water Energy Nexus is the theme for next year's World Water Day. I would like to put in a plea, though, and that is one of the things that seems to be missing, and I would love to see included, and that is tidal energy, as well as the other forms of energy. I'm working with a project called The Reef. At the moment, this is purely at a conceptual level, but the potential, Rolls-Royce and W.S. Atkins have done an appraisal of it, and they reckon it could generate from one river estuary alone in the UK, admittedly a large one, known as the Bristol Channel, something in the region of 30 terawatts, or about 12% of Britain's current energy generating. So the potential elsewhere in the world, of course, for this could be vast, and it's something else to put into the mix. And of course, it is very much water energy based. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question, and if I unpack it, it contains elements of innovation, how you find the technologies. It contains elements of financing, how you find the resources, and it also has elements of regulation and how do you make sure that there are no environmental impacts from installation. So it's a fairly loaded question. Yes, Daniel.
My name is Daniel Segai. I come from the UN Water Decade Program on Capacity Development based in Bonn, Germany. My personal feeling is that wastewater was not emphasized enough, its contribution for energy. The huge potential of wastewater that contains energy, it just by far exceeds the kind of energy that we use to treat wastewater. If I were to quote Water Environment Research Foundation, it says 10 times, it exceeds 10 times than the energy that is used to treat wastewater. The other thing is wastewater also contains valuable materials or valuable nutrients, fertilizers, and if we were to use these fertilizers, then we can also save energy that is used to produce these chemical fertilizers. And when water is scarce, the available option is to treat wastewater, because if you have to pump groundwater or if you have to transport, like what Bushan said, 200 kilometers to transport water, the energy that is used is also by far exceeds. So what I wanted to say is that investing on wastewater is energy saving. And I can give you one example that where I'm working on, that's safe use of wastewater in agriculture. That is a kind of a multilateral initiative that is done together with UNU-INWEH, FAO, WHO, and others. And what we do is we just try to promote safe use of wastewater in agriculture. We do capacity development regional workshops. So my question is, do you share my viewpoint, one? And how can we untap and explore this potential of wastewater? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. One more question here.
Yeah, I have two questions, if you don't mind. My name is Bert Dipporen from UN Habitat. I live in Nairobi, so I was very interested in the story about your East African grid and your electricity, and so Mr. Selalim Gebriot. And of course, I know the Rift Valley, so I know there's a good potential for thermal energy. But then you're talking about the big potential of hydropower, and you see it from an electricity point of view. But at the end of the day, this is a water issue, and the issue is not how to connect this country with electricity. The issue is how do you get agreement. And you have seen the articles in the newspaper when Ethiopia started diverting water, and how the government of Egypt reacted. Okay, now that person is no longer there, but okay, I think that is, so at the end of the day, your solution for East Africa and relying on hydropower, you first have to get your water act together and have the countries agree upon a shared river. So I would like to see your reaction on that one. Secondly, Mr. Togni, okay, this year you celebrated 3,000 participants. For next year, what are your plans? Because your ambition should be to have 3,000 water experts and 3,000 energy experts, so that we really have a water and energy conference. So what are your plans to do that?
Thank you for that challenge. We'll take one more question and bring it back to the panelists.
Thanks very much. My name is Wei Yu, and I'm from WWF China. And my question is very short. Nowadays, the word Nexus is very popular, or we can see it is very fashion now. And my question is, could you give us some clearly definitions about the Nexus, especially for the water energy Nexus? Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Let me bring it back. Who would like to start? There's a series of very interesting questions. Yes, Ingvar and then Bushan.
Yes, the wastewater, it's a very important issue. But I think my brain is getting older day by day. But I think I remember correctly that Sweden was the first country to start putting heat pumps or taking wastewater and get these through heat pumps and use it for district heating. I think actually we are in the Bethlehem of wastewater, heat extraction from wastewater here in Stockholm. But my Swedish colleagues, they will correct me. But this is very, very important. And for instance, in the capital of Iceland, Reykjavik, we have until recently been putting out into the sea water that has already gone through radiators in the houses. And this water has been in certain parts between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, so it is much hotter, much warmer than the water that people are drilling for down to 2 or 3 kilometers in some European cities. And obviously we are wasting a lot of energy in this way, but gradually we are extracting more and more energy out of the water before we dispose of it. But this is an enormous amount of energy that is going with the wastewater.
Okay, thank you. Bhushan.
Yeah, but I guess wastewater is more a city's issue. So yes, answer to your first question, yes, I do share your views, and I agree with you that wastewater is an important issue, particularly if you think that right now, 90% of the wastewater generated in developing countries is not treated. So, and we're talking about post-2015 goals, which includes wastewater. So naturally, there'll be a lot of interest in wastewater management and so on. And in that context, instead of just wastewater treatment, if we think about wastewater generating energy and recycling wastewater for reuse and so on, that would be in our best interest. And I think there's a lot of thought going into that as well. And I also alluded in my presentation a little bit on the different ways that it's being done. You talked about, definitely, we just talked a little bit earlier on the thermal energy on wastewater. And not just the wastewater, but there was another session here earlier this week on sludge. Yeah? And the sludge has a heat value, which is better than some of the fuels that is being used. And they're using this in Uganda and some other African countries as well. So besides then there's the thermal energy that can be used. There's a potential energy that we talked about in Amman, and that they're already in generating 3 megawatts. And then, of course, the chemical bound energy as biogas, which, again, Stockholm is a great example of it. So there are different ways, and we should explore it further. What is the bottleneck? I would say, in many cases, is the knowledge. I mean, the water utilities, the engineers there, the managers there specialize in, they've learned about providing water, but wastewater management is something more new, and especially wastewater reuse. Thanks.
I can add one more to your list, which is that for wastewater in water-scarce countries, when you're pumping out water from a very deep aquifer, the energy costs are quite high. And when you use wastewater for irrigation, you actually offset that cost also. And this is something that was explored in this initiative as well. Zlelam, there was a question posed to you quite directly about hydropower and water management.
Okay, thank you for that question. Maybe I'm not clear when I say there is a vast hydropower potential in the region. The issues related to this, the cooperative framework agreement on the Nile Basin, are related to only on the hydro projects on the Nile. But, for example, talking about the Blue Nile itself, that represents only one of the 12 river basins in Ethiopia only. If we see the entire Eastern Africa region, there is also the Congo River Basin and other resources. So the entire Blue Nile Basin may represent only less than 15% of the total hydro potential we are talking about in the Eastern Africa region. At the same time, when I say in the order of 180,000 megawatt, that includes also geothermal power. And there are many hydropower projects under development in Ethiopia. On the Blue Nile, only one is on the Blue Nile at this time. There are 4 or 5 hydropower sites, like the Gibesri, which is 2,000 megawatt, close to 2,000 megawatt capacity, Ganale, etc. So without signing that cooperative agreement, we can still have an option to develop in the order of tens of thousands of megawatt, without including the geothermal. Thank you.
So not to put words in your mouth, but are you suggesting that the cooperative framework on Nile somehow offers a roadblock to full exploitation of the hydropower potential?
Now, at this stage, even without that cooperative framework agreement, there is a hydropower development on the Blue Nile, which is a 6,000 megawatt project. But if that cooperative agreement is signed now, that would facilitate the development of many other projects. But without, there are many other sites outside the Nile Basin in the region. So the agreement, without the agreement, even we can do a lot of development with regards to hydro.
Okay, thank you. Torgny, there was a very pointed question at you.
Yes, let me address the question about should it be 6,000 participants next year? Well, maybe we need 2 weeks. Well, if I make some easy calculation of maths here, 60% of you will come back next year. We know that at the start of the week. That is what we have been repeat registrations over the last few years. So 60% will be repeat guests. So that leaves us with 40% maybe new. And if we can attract, and that is our aim, also with the energy focus next year also, people and from the energy sector, let's say maybe easy maths, that will be 1,000. So maybe if we could increase a bit, but it should not be grow that big. I think still the value of World Water Week is that you can be assured that you will meet colleagues from different parts, different actors, different sectors from all over the world to have this informal discussion and also learn from each other. So yes, we will attract. And secondly, I'm planning also now that we will not only have a one-year event on water and energy, but that will also be kept for years to come. So we can, I think that will also be some kind of triggering to attract people from outside the water community, that they can come back and also learn from a more long-term partnership building. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Josefina, you had your hand up, but let me also add something in your direction in terms of the definition of Nexus, because that's something quite important for generating partnerships. If you can't define what the Nexus is or how it's important, how can we trigger partnerships? So.
Yeah. Maybe the second part is a little bit more difficult, but the definition, maybe we can deal with that. I can imagine that the motive for that question is that we feel that when we are talking about Nexus, we are leaving out ecosystems and environmental issues, so that we are focusing mainly on production and mainly on the productive sectors, and that has been something that has been raised over and over again. But I think, you know, at the beginning of my presentation, I thought that it could be important to map out that the objectives of partnerships have to do with efficiency, security, and sustainability. And the issues of sustainability are very important when you're talking about the trade-offs between water and the energy sector. All the issues about production of hydroelectricity, improving regulation for energy production, etc. All this can have positive and negative effects on resilience. And so looking at the trade-offs between water and energy from an environmental perspective is also part of the issues we have to look at when we are looking at the interrelationship between water and energy. So the second part about how you make this operational in terms of partnerships, I don't think, one of the things that maybe I didn't say when I answered your previous question is that it seems to me that there is a ladder of partnerships, and the ladder of partnerships have been seen to be easier in the utility and industrial sector, but this is not being so much in the planning, programming, and policy making. And that's where I can see the answer to your question now. Okay.
Thank you. John, did you have a response?
Not really. I had a comment or two on all of them. I didn't feel anybody had addressed this gentleman's question about tidal power. And while I'm not an expert on that, maybe I can fire a question back in a way. It seemed to me that 30 terawatts was a huge amount of power. And I have a little bit of knowledge about what goes on in Canada, where I live, and they've been trying to do this on the Bay of Fundy for a while, with these very high tides there. And I don't think I've met with too much success. And so I wondered why you thought perhaps you could get 30 terawatts out of the Bristol Channel, which I do know a little bit about too. And how do you transmit that power? Where's the T&D come in to that equation?
Briefly, if you will, please.
For you, as quick as I can. The generation system called the Reef came out of the earlier stuff on the Severn Barrage, which had various problems, one of which was, of course, you hold the tide back, you generate a great big peak of energy at one stage during the tidal cycle. Could be in the middle of the night, and then what do you do with all that energy? It's such a lot. the idea of the reef came from the environmental side and the environmental problems from the barrage. And the idea was that you generate throughout the tidal cycle. So as the tide flows in and as it flows back out again. At both ends, you've actually got hooks up to the national grid, because we would like to see it not Cardiff to Weston, but further out between Aberthaw and Minehead. Aberthaw, there is a conventional power station. Minehead is very close to Hinkley Point. So there are potential hookups to the national grid. And because you're talking about base load, that shouldn't actually be a problem.
Okay, so it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Thanks.
yeah, I think it sort of, it conserves water very nicely, doesn't it? I think you've got a good point. But I think along with a lot of the other alternative sources of energy at the moment, if you could develop 30 terawatts, then you're overcoming that problem that wind power and solar power can't generate enough. If you can do that, you've certainly got something going. Okay. On another point there, I was thinking about the wastewater and energy that this other gentleman was asking about. I don't think anybody would disagree about coming up with all of those good things you can do with wastewater, and I think it's going on in the developed world. I think it's in the developing world that's the problem, where we need to get these technologies out there. And I think there's sort of two angles to this, because in the developed world, our world here, we're having to spend probably a lot of money to retrofit older infrastructure to do this. Whereas in the developing world, if you can get the funding, you have the opportunity to build it from scratch and do it very efficiently. So it was just a point I thought might be worth making. And the other point on the hydro power in Africa, I was thinking about transboundary hydro issues, transboundary power issues. And I think there's some good examples of resolutions for these sorts of things going on in the Mekong right now, or there's a big problem there they're trying to resolve. And also in Tajikistan, I think they're having a debate with, is it Uzbekistan next door, about one supplying the power, one supplying the water for agriculture, and they're trying to trade them off. And I think there are always sort of good examples of this that can be looked at worldwide and brought back to other areas. Because we should remember that hydro is not nowadays just about power, it's about dual purpose, because it's reservoirs as well. It's about water supply as much as anything. And I think we need to build that into the equation. So just some thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, you also had some points.
Yeah, I'll just try to, I think I can touch on two questions with one statement. But going back to the issues of knowledge gaps, the issues of differences between the water and energy domains, one that we didn't mention is the speed of knowledge development, the speed of innovation, which tends to be a lot quicker in the energy field. Now, with a caveat, that often has to do with the private sector research, private sector funded R&D, which you don't get in water, and you don't get in things like tidal, because then there's an ownership, there's the ownership aspect. So you'd need to have some sort of government authority, or I'm looking for the word, but like Hydro-Quebec is a state-operated system. And these tend to not, it's just the nature of the beast. They tend to not be as innovative and forward-looking than your larger energy companies that are part of the market.
Okay, very interesting. And we will come back. Bushan, you had another.
No, she had a question on the energy, water energy nexus definition. Maybe.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to, just the nexus, and I agree, it's thrown out. Every few years, new words come up, and then we get bored with them and think of something else. But the nexus, really, the definition, you know what a Venn diagram is, from grade 2? Well, the nexus is the it's the intersection. So it's how do you find commonalities between two systems? So if you have a larger Venn diagram, then the nexus will be where all three bubbles connect, and then you can go on to many dimensions. Fundamentally, that's what it means.
Thank you. And we kind of know from the description that we got about the asymmetries that Torgny was talking about. That means that the two bubbles of the Venn diagram are likely of very different sizes, yeah. and the overlap may be skewed in one way or another. Let's go through another round of questions. I had a hand in the back. Yes. In the very back, please.
Hi, I'm Silvio Pereira from the Technical University of Denmark, and I just submitted my dissertation on a modeling framework for water and energy systems. And I found some of the challenges that Mr. Holmgren mentioned, namely the differences in spatial scale and management between these two systems. So actually modeling them jointly is a very complicated task. And I was wondering if, for those of you at the UN system, if they thought that valuation and pricing of water was a good mechanism for tackling this, the negative interlinkages between water and energy systems. And if so, what are you doing and what are you planning to do on trying to move these mechanisms forward?
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. One more question here.
My name is Indika from CapNet. My question is, when I listening to the definition of Nexus, the question comes to my mind is it not the same as the integrated water resources management we were talking about? And is there any difference? Because we can tell any two or three sectors which has commonalities, we can say as a nexus, like water, energy, and food nexus. So I think it's the same as the integrated water resource management.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that interesting question, and we'll come back to that. There's a question at this end.
Thank you very much. I'm actually Rasul Mikkelsen from Grundfos. I'm actually one of these few from the private sector. I think is one of the big problems for this Water Week, as actually the private sector is lacking. I will come back on this one. It seems we have a lot of data. We have a lot of analysis, evaluation. What is the problem? When it comes to solutions, then we don't have so much data on what is the solution. We think there is a lot of solution out there, but how we can scale these solutions, especially in the rural areas. While electrification of Africa is reach the cities, not the rural. It will be very difficult if we can imagine in 2030, the whole rural Africa has electricity. And then renewable energy comes to the picture. None of you guys mentioned, for example, solar, especially in Africa. The beauty of solar and how we can adapt the solar and use the solar for the Africa electrification, water, whatever. Comes back to the next week, or next year's Water Week, I will strongly recommend it that we not discuss the data, we discuss the solutions. I think because I mean, my heart and respect for the academia, it seems we have a lot of data, but we don't know how we're going to use this data. So with the next year, I think you should, Mr. Holmgren, put 3 agenda and say, well, we gather academia, we gather NGOs, we gather UN, we gather multilateral, bilateral, to sit together 3 days and come with some suggestion how we're going to solve these problems. Otherwise, on 2030, we have a struggle in the same problems.
Okay, thank you. Is there another question? Yes.
Christian from King's College London. I had a question with regards to the role and practices of private firms and how it fits into the Nexus. In this globalized world, one of the major issues is from profit-driven approaches used by many of these private firms, often at the expense of the environment or efficiency. How do you ensure the responsible action of these private firms, and how does it link into the Nexus?
Okay, thank you very much. So another set of very interesting questions. Who would like to go first? Torgny?
I can start. On next year, yeah, I totally agreement with you that private sector should be here and also go for solutions. And what we have seen over the last few years that it is increased interest from private sector. I think last year we had some 500-600 private sector participants, but you are totally right that our idea with the World Water Week is, of course, we have the scientific base, but we should bridge science to solutions through practitioners and also have people in the sector itself. So that is our aim. And let me also address one issue. Some of you have touched upon it, and also I think some of our colleague panelists, that is finance. And we do see an increased interest from the financial sector also. It's very early days in the water sector, because water compared to energy is mainly so far financed through the public sector. But we do see, with the increased demand on water resources, also a need for broadening the scope of finance. And there is now, as I mentioned this Monday morning when we discussed with World Economic Forum, a increased interest in the mere risk of supply crisis of water for the private sector. So it's coming up on the agenda for private sector more and more. And also when we discuss with the financial sector, so actually in CIVI we are starting a project together with the financial sector this coming fall to look into how we can both find win-win situations where we get financial sector more involved and also come up with solutions, or also a provision of financial sector tools to finance water in the future. So I hope we can report back and have some financial sector participants at next World Water Week.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else would like to take a shot? Yeah.
With regard to solar energy and the discussion of that, of course solar is very, very important, and solar, as we know, especially when you get to places where there are summer houses and so on, then people in the industrialized countries use solar a lot for electricity, and then they have batteries for collecting this. This is quite expensive, and the problem in the developing countries is not solved with an energy source that is so difficult to preserve or to store. Solar thermal is great wherever you use it, because you can easily store the heat in water or some other media, and then you get the heat when the sun is shining, and you can use it for bath water or what have you, or heating during the night also, because you can store it. And the big problem with solar is that it is not so reliable. The capacity factor is so small, and to use solar electricity where you have a grid, yes, you can add it to the grid, but standalone solar electricity, well, the battery producers, they really have to do some new inventions, I think, to make it something that is reliable. But it is marvelous when you use it for where you have no other possibility. I have liked very much these photos of camels with solar screens, where they're taking medicine in developing countries sometimes, and then they are traveling by day, they are keeping everything cool. But it can be used in odd circumstances, but it is not in the way reliable that we want to have in our general infrastructure.
Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, this is being webcast, so you need to use a mic. I'll come back to you in a moment. There was two other comments by a panelist, Josefina and then John.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I just want to come back to the question of the profit-driven approach and at the expense of the environment, and how you can change that, to some extent. I suppose you refer mainly about, industrial sector, the energy companies, and what is their behavior. And I think the way it's happening is obviously to encourage and to support social corporate responsibility. But there is no doubt that even in those terms, companies are really do that because they have motives. Even when they improve social corporate responsibility activities, they have motives, and many of them are benefits and profits. And what we have observed is that obviously, and that's what it was said before, is that water security is affecting the companies, and they are interested in, even energy companies are interested in ensuring that water is managed properly. So there is a private interest to improve how we manage water and how, whether there is more enough water security. And I do know that there is some initiatives, I'm not sure whether it's the same one that has been described before, of improving precisely, encouraging stewardship in relation to water and energy. And it's starting, but that's something that is ongoing. Thank you.
John?
Well, actually, I was going to address the same question because I thought it was sort of aimed at me, and I thank Josephina for picking it up. I can only endorse what she said and just add to it that actually there have been a lot of sessions about private sector work here at this conference this week, at least in my opinion. I think I've been to at least 3 of them. And a lot of them have focused on this whole issue of CSR, corporate social responsibility. And rather than sort of saying it's a matter of philanthropy, sort of throwing some money around to keep people happy, a lot of them now saying it is a real core business practice. As you would do many other things in business, you do this. And yes, you do it because there's a good business case, and it may be driven by, as Josephina said, security, allocation of water, energy issues, and that sort of thing. It could also be driven by regulation and standards, but companies are certainly getting it, in the developed world anyway, that they have to think about these things and build them into their business as usual practice. It's not just a matter of, as I say, going out and doing this philanthropically. There is a good business case. In the long run, it does benefit them. I think the difficulty is when you get into the small and medium-sized enterprises, which I mentioned earlier, that they don't have the resources and they don't have the motivations to do this. They're trying to just make ends meet. So it's a lot harder. And that is, I think, a challenge for many agencies working overseas as to how to deal with those industries. I've seen a lot of that firsthand, and that's a difficult issue because they make a very big impact on water basins. I think the number is something like 70% of a lot of water basins are occupied by small and medium-sized enterprises. So it's a big issue.
Thank you. Did any of the other panelists have a point?
I'd just like to address maybe two other questions that weren't addressed. The first is the valuation of water. And it's okay for energy is a tradable, marketable commodity. Water is seen as a right, but it also the water services is obviously, there's a value to that. The water resource, which might or might not be, which it would generally use to produce energy, might not be. So the valuation of water is a good idea fundamentally, but it's a really, really tricky issue. If you're valuing what comes out of the tap that's been treated, that's been pumped, then that's, yeah, okay. You can put some, if it's in its natural state, whether it's flowing or in a river or in a lake or something, the valuation is very different. Now, Nexus versus IWRM. Well, I was never a big fan of IWRM, and the R stands for resources anyway. So if you're talking about the nexus between energy, really you're talking about energy, water services and energy, or you're talking about water resources to produce energy. So the IWRM doesn't quite fit because of the R. Whereas the nexus kind of looks at both water as a service and as a resource. The other thing is that energy is often outside of the basin. When you're talking about IWRM, you're really talking about basin level management. And energy can come from different sources in or outside the basin and can have impacts, water impacts outside the basin in which you're operating or trying to do your IWRM. So it's a little bit different. The third thing is when we realized when we were writing the report that this whole Nexus movement that started, maybe 5-10 years ago, is actually replacing IWRM, because IWRM is this all-encompassing, dogmatic thing. Whereas where there's this nexus, whether it's the food, water nexus, whether it's climate, food, energy, things like that, it narrows the scope, whereas IWM is too broad. And the last point on that is that if you're looking at water, food, energy, climate change, environment, that nexus, the fact is water is this nexus. Water is the thing that connects all of these other sectors. And so this Nexus approach is a way to bring in these other sectors specifically one by one, instead of trying to just paint a picture across all of those developmental domains.
Okay, very, very interesting. So if I were to use your Venn diagram example as concepts, if you have IWRM and Nexus, there would be some overlap, but they won't overlap completely with each other, if I understood correctly.
That's the way I understand it. It's purely theoretical.
Okay. And then to the question around valuation, what I would add is that there's also a heightened sense of political sensitivity around this whole debate about not just valuation, but pricing is even more sometimes politically toxic as a topic to discuss, and which means sometimes it's challenging to bring in a rational debate, and Rick is absolutely right. This notion of the Declaration of Water and Sanitation as a human right in 2010 have sort of amplified that discussion. So there's actually a lot to be done there. So I saw the gentleman here wanted to come back, and I'll then come back to you as well.
I just comment on the solar, because what I'm discussing is not the big scale solar. For the rural Africa that is disconnected from everything, also grid, solar is solution. Today we're providing water for 100,000 people in arid and semi-arid in Kenya by using solar power only. And it's functioning very well. And they're not using any battery. What they're also doing, actually now, they're using the solar panels for charging their mobile and the lamps. Because when the water tank's full, the pump stops, but solar panels is still producing energy. So you have to actually multiple impact by using the solar energy. So what I'm thinking is the small scale, not big scale, providing water for 2 million people using solar, but small scale in rural area.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I agree with Richard and Safar on that the water valuation and pricing is a very thorny issue. But it's been 2 decades since the Dublin Principles, and recently the Water Framework Directive stressed the importance of using economic principles as a mechanism for better water management. So if these fora are not used to move this topic forward and take the debate, even however thorny it may be, then when are we going to be talking about these issues?
Okay, so that's another check mark for Torgny for next World Water Week, perhaps to have discussion around valuation.
I should point out there was a session this morning about private sector in water, and the first half of it dealt with, the second half dealt with valuation of water in business, and then the World Business Council for Sustainable Development announced this guide, and it's called Business Guide to Water Valuation. And a lot of presentations went along with this, talking about people sort of dealing with this subject. And this is their attempt to provide business with a guideline as to how to deal with valuation. And they went globally and looked at, I think, something like 25 businesses all over the world and how they were doing it, and utilities and so on. I haven't had time to read it. I just glanced through the executive summary, but this is supposed to be a very good start, because they were saying that 5 years ago, I think, at this conference, there was nobody really talking about this, and to have got this far, they were very happy, and they seem to be on the verge of saying it was, I think, they were leaning towards total economic measurement or something like that. It's not my area, but or valuation. But a lot of it's described in this document, and I think you could probably get it straight off the website, or they may even have some copies still here for people.
Thank you. I'll give maybe the final question to the lady in the middle. You're okay. Any other? Yes. Okay, so you get the last question, and then I'll come round to the panelists to give maybe your one final round of 1 to 2 minute summary of what you take away and what you would like us to take away moving forward to the World Water Day next year. So, yes, sir. Go ahead.
So it's not really a question, it's more a comment. Yann Lemoine from EDF, so private sector, French electricity producer. So as John Payne said, there is quite a lot of initiatives going on in the private sector, WBCSD in particular, and initiatives to calculate water footprints of energy producing activities. And there's one in special, in particular, that I'm not sure whether you know about it. That's why I'm speaking today, which was launched during the last World Water Forum in Marseille, 2012, and which objective is to try and establish a framework to calculate the water footprint, local water footprint of any kind of energy producing activity, from coal extraction to nuclear power plants, for example, trying to produce a set of indicators which will reflect all the interactions between different kinds of water use, both on quantity and quality terms, with the environment. So I'm not going to speak about this here, it's not the point, but if anyone is interested by this project, I'll be pleased to answer questions after. But just to say that things are going on in the private sector also, and because, well, I think private companies, well, I'm new in all this, but private companies are more and more aware of the need to communicate and to report on these issues, and also for their own operations to manage the risk, reputational risk, supply risk, regulatory risk. So I think even though it's always driven by profit, that's an important issue, and it's an important issue to come for most energy companies. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'll also park a final question with the panelists before I give you your last word. One issue that we have not touched on is the impact of climate change on both water and energy sectors. And the reason why I say this is I was involved in a study about 3 years ago in Canada where we asked different sectors to respond to what they thought was the biggest impact of climate change on their sectors. And we had the nuclear thermal sector looking at it together. We also had hydropower sector looking at it. And both groups came back and said water was not really a concern for them vis-a-vis climate change. This was somewhat surprising. But I would be interested if any of you have also encountered a similar experience, and what is the reason for this kind of, I would say, almost nonchalant attitude towards climate change impacts. So in this case, we'll start at the far end, ladies first with Josefina, and we'll work our way to this end.
So let me understand the rule. Can we make our final statement, or do you want an answer to that question?
Well, if you can roll in both, that would be wonderful.
Well, for the question on climate, I think I will leave my partners to do that. But for my final message, I think I like to, because I understand that we are trying also to build the messages for World Water Day.
Absolutely.
So for my final message, I think I would say that implementing the Nexus requires to deal with the partnership challenge. That would be my message. I think regulation is important. It's important to create enabling environment and incentives. You know, some people were saying this here. But realizing benefits requires a variable architecture of partnerships. And if we want to have the innovation, the ownership, the effectiveness, we have to ensure that we provide the kind of framework that is not too structured. Partnerships will create that kind of innovation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. John.
You did with the climate as well.
Well, thank you, appreciate it. I think on the climate change one, just a brief comment. Living in Canada too, I think people feel that we have lots of water there, and that is a bit of a fallacy. It seems the case, but it's a matter of availability. So that message may not have got through in some ways, but I think the message on climate change has got through to municipalities. It may not be on industry, but I see a lot of requests both in North America and also internationally, and you see it in Europe as well, of citizen towns wanting adaptation to climate change plans. These are coming out all the time. Everybody's got the message. I listened to a talk from somebody in Amsterdam last year, and they were trying to predict what would happen if the sea level went up by so many feet or meters, sorry. So I think that message has got out to certain sectors, but perhaps not to others. And it is a matter of when that impact suddenly arrives, as we see in terms of a scarcity hitting an industry, then people react, of course, when it gets to your own back door. I suppose on the final thought, this conference has been a lot about cooperation. That's the theme. And I think as far as we're talking about water and energy, I'm hoping that there's a sort of wake-up call to both sectors so that when they sort of sit down and say, okay, what am I going to do about water, in my case in industry, or what am I going to do about energy, that they might suddenly think there may be some benefits to talking to the other guys, both in their own water box, in their own industry, and also outside in their river basins. And it's a sort of bit like that analogy, when we're all lining up for lunch, and we're all trying to get lunch together, and we're also rushing at the counter, and we all block one another, and no one's really getting lunch. But then somebody backs away and says, well, you go first, and then the line starts to work rather nicely. So that's a sort of, concession we have to make to one another. You have to back off a little bit on your self-interest for the communal good. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you. Ingvar.
Well, climate change, there's been a lot of discussion over the last decade on this issue. But gradually, what we are seeing, the people who are watching this and people writing about this, it's quite clear that this is happening at a much faster scale than we believed. And even now, for instance, in my country, Iceland, which has been living mainly on fish, this is affecting us already because it seems, and we hope that it is only temporarily, but we fear that it will continue, that the temperature of the sea north of Iceland and south of Iceland has been changing. And when the sea to the north, as the temperature goes up, then it is melting more and more of the ice from the North Pole, and also there is more ice being melted in the Greenland ice cap. And in Iceland, our glaciers are some disappearing and all of them going very much down. And all of this water is going into the sea, and that changes the currents. And so that one of the main pelagic fish stocks that we have been after in Iceland for decades, since we had equipment to fish this, have disappeared south of the country, south of the island. But it is increasing up north because certain fish species, they are very choosy about the temperature of the water where they are. And the same you hear from scientists who are studying in the Himalayas. And obviously, we have to do what is within our facilities to do to prevent this. We cannot prevent it, but we can reduce the speed. And that is what the International Panel on Climate Change has been doing. And that is what we are trying to get the politicians to confirm in how to address this. It's really scary to hear what is happening in Siberia, in the permafrost areas there. There is so much of the permafrost areas there that they're giving much more water. This water is flowing into the North Polar Sea, into that area. And that is affecting this from there. And thus the ice is melting faster. And it spreads really very, very fast. So that is why those of us who have devoted our professional life in renewable energy sources that are good as relates to this. For instance, with geothermal, it's mainly used for heating, and heating houses and cooling houses has been driven by fossil fuels in most countries of the world and still is. And obviously, if we can reduce that by getting heat that has not been used through the centuries until now, then that's a big issue. The same applies, of course, to use the solar and to use the wind and all these renewables. And also the hydro. While we have some glaciers, while we have some water stored, we should definitely continue using it to produce electricity, which is not producing any greenhouse gases.
Okay, thank you. I'll, in the interest of time, pass on to Torgny.
I started off with addressing three asymmetries between the energy sector and water sector, which is technology, institutions, and economic aspects. And having taken part in this session and listened to some other sessions during the last few days here at the World Water Week, I guess that the economic aspects, the valuation, the pricing is a key driver to changes or adaptation in the first two, the technology and innovation. And here, of course, we should differentiate between water as a human right and as an economic good. Having said that, I think to price water is key, to price the ecosystem and give the true valuation. And that I look forward for the next World Water Week and World Water Days to address this issue. This is a specific issue. How do we price water in a way that we could have more efficient use given the increased demand and scarcity of water? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Quickly on the climate change, sure, I think people are already feeling the heat, especially in developing countries, and water is definitely the means through which most of the impacts are felt. And in Nepal, for example, the hydropower industry is already concerned about this as well. There are studies that say that the hydropower potential of Nepalese rivers are going down by around 28% or so by the end of the century. But overall, I'd say that what the questions that were raised, the comments that came clearly pointed out that there is something going on, whether that be tidal power, or whether that be energy from wastewater, or solar energy in the villages of Africa. There are solutions out there. We need to work on it. And I think on World Water Day and World Water Week, we should try to, I agree with the gentleman's comment that we should try to focus on solutions. And World Water Day could be seen as an event where we raise awareness on the solutions to this nexus.
Thank you. Slaylam.
I think my message here is that looking at the region I came from, the Eastern Africa region, there is a clear need to expand the energy system. And there is also a need to pursue a more efficient linkage between the water and the energy systems in the future. So there is a need to develop capacity at an experts level as well as at the political level, because there are a lot of decisions to be made soon in expanding those sectors, given the level of electrification, the level of generation, etc. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Nick, you have the last word.
Thanks. Just quickly for the climate change, there's also not just the impacts, but there's adaptation and mitigation. And you used to say adaptation is about water because the impacts are about water, and that mitigation is on the energy side. But with the, exploring this water-energy nexus, you realize that there are water impacts to your choices or your energy mix. So that water can be considered as a facilitator as much as a fence or a barrier. In terms of the overall statement or something, one thing that came back with the comments, and it kept coming back, is that we've got different scales of problems and different scales of solutions. With the World Water Development Report, we're really looking at a global, a global aspect. But clearly, there's local level, interventions that can be done, whether it's solar or what have you, that might not appear on a global map or a global pie chart. But that doesn't mean they're not important, and it doesn't mean there should not be a place for them to be discussed. I'm just wearing the World Water Development hat, so these things kind of fall on the wayside because they're the slice of pie is just so small. But it doesn't mean it's not important. And finally, since I do have the very last word, I'd like to invite you all tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, it's water and energy beyond the nexus. So we're going to actually have my colleague here, and a few other people from the energy milieu. We'll have someone from the World Bank who will be discussing these water and energy co-projects on desal and energy from wastewater, these things that came up today. So I invite you all to join us tomorrow at 9. And thank you, Adil.
Thank you very much, Rick. Again, we had a very interesting discussion. I thank you very much for engaging with us, and those who are watching us remotely through our webcast, we also thank them for their interest. For me, it was extremely illuminating, and I can't tell you how much I've been educated by this panel. And it has also given us some very interesting thoughts of how to organize the World Water Day and what kind of issues would we need to take forward. I will not try to summarize any of the discussion. We have a colleague here from UN Water who's helping us pulled together these ideas. These will be put online on the World Water Day website, and we will take up the concepts and ideas with us to Tokyo and to elsewhere, wherever the Water Energy Nexus is discussed on the World Water Day next year. Thank you very much. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause to our panelists.